Hey now, everybody, we are back. Brand new Take Aim podcast, episode 255. It's the middle of October, but man, it seems like some big deer are hitting the ground, and excited this week. Speaking of big deer, happy to have Josh Honeycutt back with us from Realtree, and you also see Josh on Midwest Whitetail. But Josh killed a great buck down in Kentucky. We kind of talk about the previous podcast and tie in some of that with this one, but there is a lot of info nuggets in this podcast. Josh is just literally a wealth of knowledge when it comes to deer and deer hunting, and obviously he's a writer for Realtree, and that's one of the reasons why the guy is on it. But it's a great podcast, full of good stuff, great info from Josh, and just appreciate having him on the show again. And another thing, guys, I know I talk about HuntStand a lot, but they are doing a once in a blue moon sale, and highly suggest. This is the biggest discount I've ever seen from HuntStand. It's 25% off the pro plan, so make sure you guys do that. Enter code SPOOKY at checkout. And one of the cool things about HuntStand that there's other apps that just charge for one feature, like the moon phases, the rising moon, the setting moon. This is all included in HuntStand, so make sure you use that discount SPOOKY, get 25% off. You'll probably never see that type of discount again. It's only valid through Halloween, so make sure to check that out. And thanks again for Josh, and we'll see you guys again next week. All right, boys and girls, we are live and back for a brand new Take Aim podcast, and excited to once again have Josh Honeycutt from Realtree with us. And Josh, what's going on?
Not a lot. How you guys doing?
Good, man. Excited to have you back.
Absolutely. Happy to be here.
Yeah. Well, congrats on the awesome deer you just killed down in Kentucky. And I know we just spoke, maybe it was about 6 weeks ago, we had you on the podcast, and we talked a lot about early season hunting. Well, now we're kind of in mid-October, what everybody calls kind of the lull. But it seems like more and more guys are killing big deer like you just did in this part of October. So I just kind of wanted to go through the paces and what kind of techniques and what you learned, and maybe some of the things you changed from last year to get this deer.
Yeah, I think some of the bigger lessons for my season have kind of occurred before I actually killed this deer. It may not necessarily come from this buck himself, but it's been a fun year. Just to start off, you talk about the October lull. I think that's a big misconception among a lot of hunters out there, and myself included at one point in time. I kind of believed in that October lull, just like many have and still do. And from my own experience, though, it just isn't real. And a lot of the research backs it up. And I'm no biologist, I'm no researcher, but I've looked at a lot of biologists' research, and there's a lot of studies out there. Actually, more studies than not suggest and prove and show that deer actually don't have a lull in October, or any time for that matter. Especially during deer season. So, the research shows that deer gradually start moving more throughout the summer, and then gradually through September increase in October, and increase all the way up until the rut in November, or whenever the rut falls, for those southern states. But, and then it finally starts tapering off after the rut. And that includes daylight movement. That's not overall movement. That's daylight movement considered as well. So, it is interesting. I don't know where the phenomenon came from. Actually, I think I do know where that myth came from. I think it stems from the fact that there's a huge shift in whitetail behavior in early to mid-October. And then they kind of come out of that shift into another shift toward late October, and so it kind of creates that misconception that deer are moving less from early to mid-October, from, say, October 5th or 10th to all the way until, say, October 20th or 25th. And a big part of that is food source related. It is bedding area preference related, and it's also hunting pressure related. And it's not making those deer move less. It's just changing where they do move.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Josh. I was going to hit on that a little bit. If you thought, you included, because you said you were a self-believer at one time of the October lull, do you think it was just the change in the food patterns and kind of setting up when you're doing a lot of summer scouting or walking ground before you hunt, Do you think it's just all basically like a timing issue?
Yeah, and I wasn't shifting with the deer. And I think the people who still believe in an October lull, I think they're the same way. They're not shifting with those deer. And it may not be necessarily something they can control. They might hunt a small property and deer just simply shift off and they can't access where those deer are actually at, as it transitions into October. So it may not be something that someone can control, especially if they're hunting those small properties. But if you've got a big acreage, private land-wise, or if you access, big acreages of public, you can relocate those deer for sure. And throughout summer, we spend our time glassing big fields, focusing on the edges of food sources, edges of some staging areas, and we're not really in the big timber a lot of the times. We're not anywhere, in that early successional habitat where they're bedding at. And so, a lot of the work that you do throughout summer, it's not useless come October. I wouldn't say that, but it's not as pertinent as it is for the first few weeks of deer season for those who can enjoy either late August or early September openers, even those that start in mid-September or late September for that matter. And I would even argue that some summer patterns will extend into early October for those who don't start hunting until October 1st. It just depends on the deer. Some shift earlier, some shift later. But, those food sources are changing right around early to mid-October. They're transitioning off those green food sources. And I wouldn't say off of, but they're kind of using them less. Those ag fields, soybeans, stuff like that. They're kind of pushing, especially on heavy acre and crop years. They're pushing toward those mass crops, those hard mass crops. Even some soft mass crops are starting to drop. So it's just apples. That kind of that's an October time frame for some people. Some it's not, but it's just really a big change in food sources. And the other thing too, like we talked, I think on the last show, deer use different bedding areas throughout the season, and so a lot of the times, the reason that they shift a bedding area is because their food source changes, their preferred food source anyway. And so they might, relocate to a new bedding area that's closer to that new food source. So there's all these changes. Plus hunters are in the woods, and that hunting pressure isn't creating an October lull, but that hunting pressure is kind of moving the deer around a little bit. And so, all these things come together to kind of create this perfect storm of change. And some hunters, those who I think believe in the October lull, are just failing to shift with that change.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And a lot of what I would call, Josh, improvements I've made just in myself and hunting technique is I've done the same thing where I've gone towards a lot more timber in both my morning and evening sets, and especially being in Michigan, you really, unless it's really a special type of night, and just a rare occurrence that you may kill a mature buck on a field edge, but it's almost nil. So I've made that transition here of, like you said, mostly mass crops and trying to hunt some of those areas and doing a better job of identifying those bedding areas. Because like you said, there's a lot that when we talk about the lull that I don't think we count for. The combines are firing up a lot more of those farmers are feet on the ground, whatever they're doing, they're working, but it's feet on the ground when they're in a bean field or a corn field, and, even small game hunters. All that stuff kind of starts, and like you said, it's just such a good word to use is transition, because those deer do move and kind of evade some of that pressure, what they think's pressure.
Yeah, absolutely. For some people, that transition is going to look different. For some people, they're pushing on to, white oak, some it's red oak, some it's water oaks, there's so many, bur oaks, post, there's so many different kinds of oak trees. So that's why it's so beneficial to get out during the postseason, and even the really early season, both when the leaves are on and when the leaves are off, and familiarize yourself with those tree species identification, that skill, because that's huge, and knowing where those are located at. And then when you start hearing people say, oh, well, there's a heavy red oak acre crop this year, oh, there's a heavy white oak, that doesn't guarantee that your red oaks or white oaks are dropping, but there's a decent chance that they might be. So that's it's not as simple as that, because there are plenty of other factors that determine whether or not your particular trees are producing. But that starting point. But yeah, that's big. For some other people, that transition isn't necessarily oaks, though. Not everybody has acorns. It could be, deer are primarily browse animals. So I mean, if you've got some really good early successional habitat where the sun really gets to the forest floor, maybe there's not as many trees, the canopy isn't as dense. Deer are primarily browse animals. So, people think, that deer just eat soybeans and corn year round. No, they don't. They're primarily browse animals. And so if you've got some really good early successional habitat, growth that's anywhere from 3 to 5 or 6 or 7 foot tall, deer love that stuff. They bed in it. They feed in it. They feel comfortable walking in that during daylight. And this particular deer that I killed just a couple days ago, he was, I guess it was Sunday, so what is today, Tuesday? Yeah, I guess a couple days ago. He was in the edge of a CRP field. He came out of some timber, eased into that CRP field, and felt comfortable. And he's not a super old deer. He's a 4.5-year-old buck. But, most 4.5-year-old deer don't like walking in daylight in the open, but CRP's not the open, they feel comfortable in that. So, again, there's a big change, big transition, and that's just, for all the different hunters out there, it's all about figuring out what that transition and that change looks like for their particular properties that they hunt.
Yeah, that's very true. So on this deer, Josh, I want to talk about, or ask you a couple questions, just, that area that you killed him in, was that, you think when he came out right then, was that a food source, mass crop-wise, in that timber, or was this a spot he just happened to be bedding in and then did transition to food later?
Yeah, I think, it's kind of hard to, that particular property that I killed this deer on is the first sit of the year on that farm. I'll back up just for a half second and talk about what led up to it. There's 3 farms that I hunt primarily. And if you follow my season on Midwest Whitetail, I refer to them as the East Farm, the Central Farm, and the North Farm. And so I spent the most of the first, I guess, 6 weeks and 5 or 6 weeks, however long it's been now, of deer season, hunting the East Farm and the Central Farm. And those are primarily crop farms with row crop farms, soybeans and corn with timber, and so it was interesting because I didn't have any luck on the Central Farm, but on the East Farm, and I think all this happened after we talked last, because we talked before deer season opened, I believe. But
yeah, just before. I think did you tell me, Josh, it was like the first Saturday in September, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, I think we talked that week right before the Saturday.
Yep. So the first probably month of deer season I spent on the East Farm, and I had a 100 mainframe 8-pointer with some extra points that I was targeting there for the first part of deer season, what I would call the early season. And so I had 3 separate encounters with him. The first at the very early, right after he went out of velvet, I saw him out in the bean field. The beans were still green. But then he started transitioning. He started kind of reclusing back toward his bed. He wasn't making it to those beans as much in daylight. Oh, people say, oh, there's your lull. Well, not really. His food sources changes. He was hanging out closer in a different bedding area, using different bedding areas. So I saw him that first time out in the beans early in the season. Well, I saw him 2 more times after that, but I wasn't seeing him get to those beans. Even though they were still green, he wasn't making it to those beans very often in daylight. I'm sure he still did it from time to time whenever I wasn't there, but the times that I was there, I actually did a couple of hanging hunts and pushed into his bedding area. And I hung one day and hung a stand, climbed up, and he stood out of his bed 50 yards away, and done it again a couple of days later in a slightly different spot, trying to take advantage of knowing where he was bedded at. And he stood up 40 yards away and came as close as 35, but he just never did give me a shot because it's real thick stuff in there. That's where that's where big deer bed. So, even though I had high winds both days, so I was able to get in there and hang very quietly and get set up very quietly. But the point there is he was spending all of his time in that bedding area. So the deer was getting up every time. The day that I saw him out in the beans, he got up around sunset. The other 2 times that I saw him in his bed, he got up around sunset. Well, earlier in the season, he made it all the way out into the beans because that was what he wanted to eat. He was going to the soybeans to eat. But the latter 2 times, even though he got up out of his bed about the same exact time, he stayed in that bedding area and fed all around in there until it got dark, because that's what he was targeting. He was getting the acorns that were dropping around in his bed. So there is a brief illustration of the difference in changing in October lull. The deer actually stood up and still fed, the same amount of time all 3 afternoons. But his food sources made him do something slightly different behavior-wise. So, it's just interesting and I think that's really a good example of what changes. It appears that deer aren't moving as much. But if you actually measured and counted the amount of time he spent on his feet eating each of those 3 afternoons, the soybean encounter plus the 2 bedding area encounters, he was actually moving and taking the same number of steps, spending the same amount of time on his feet in daylight. It's just the food source made him do it just a little bit differently.
Gotcha. Yeah, that's super interesting. That is, such a key, feature in this podcast. To listen to what you just said, Josh, is basically start working hard or harder at identifying those bedding areas. So if we back up a little bit, Josh, what in the world put you in that position that gave you the idea to that point that was his bedding area?
Well, I started outside and worked inward. I started out earlier in the season sitting on the edges of fences, just like all the experts tell you to do. And they're right. That's a great starting point. That's where you should start. It doesn't matter if you hunt private, public, wherever. Start outside, work inward, because there's no sense in pushing all the way into a bed if you got a deer that's making it to the food source. It doesn't matter if it's September, October, November, December, or January. If they're making it to the food, why risk going in any further? So that's where I started at early in the season, and I gradually worked inward. I do a lot of hanging hunts. I pack a mobile set, sticks, really lightweight sticks and stand, and I pack all that, my gear, my hunting gear, my camera gear, and I pack in. I do a lot of hanging hunts, and so I just started outward and worked inward, and I would just push a little closer and a little closer. I bet I hung probably 10 different stands between the first encounter and actually, the last encounter I had, which I never did actually kill that deer. He ended up shifting. I was probably, even though it sounds like I was being aggressive by pushing into his bed, I was actually probably being a little too passive, because I let too much time elapse between, when I first started hunting that deer and when I pushed in and saw him on that last encounter. What ended up happening was those beans ended up turning, and deer still eat yellow beans. A lot of people say they won't eat yellow beans. They will. But his food source changed again, and so his bedding area ended up changing. And that deer doesn't spend the rut on our farm anyway. He spends the early season on our farm and transitions to his rut range sometime around early to mid-October, and that's exactly what happened. And so I just, even though it sounds like I was being too aggressive, I was being too passive, and I let too much time elapse. And so that deer changed, and so I spent the next week or week and a half targeting some other deer on a different farm. Never did come close, and so I finally decided to transition to the north farm, which is where I ended up killing my deer on Sunday afternoon. And that was the first sit of the year there. It's a big CRP farm, and so this is a big roundabout to get back to your original question. It's a big CRP farm. It's 200 acres, and I'd say 180 of it, 170 of it's CRP, and then it's got 2 big long tree rows on each end.
CRP, that's all I was going to say. That's a lot.
Yeah, it is. And it's
crazy.
Really hard to hunt. It's really hard to bow hunt, especially. Yeah, you got that much expanse of CRP. It can be varied, and it's big. It's big. It's a big patch. It's not like it's timber with intermittent pockets of CRP, which is much easier to maneuver and hunt. This is just big CRP, and then 2 big long tree rows on the east and west ends. So. It is tough to bow hunt a lot of times. We've killed some deer with the bow on that farm. We've been hunting it for about 5 years. But it was the early muzzleloader season here in Kentucky. It's a 2-day deal, always in mid-October. And so I'm primarily a bow hunter, but I'm not a purist. Come muzzleloader season, I pick one up. So, it's just one of those things. So, it was interesting, though, because the first day of muzzleloader, my uncle actually sat at that same stand and saw this deer and another one of our targets that we call GP, which is a big, massive, heavy, wide 7-pointer. Actually saw that deer and the buck that I killed. They were still together. I don't think they were bachelor, but they were together at that point, at that morning anyway. And he actually saw those deer go up through out through the CRP about 170, 180 yards away. He elected not to shoot. And he didn't hunt the rest of the weekend over there, and so I decided to go to that particular stand that Sunday afternoon. So that would have been, he saw that deer Saturday morning, and then I went not that afternoon, not the next morning, but then that next afternoon on Sunday afternoon. So it was a day and a half later. And just simply because of that real-time information. Real-time info is crucial. It's critical to success. It doesn't, and I know that that was a day and a half prior, but it's still close enough to be current information. Whether you get that current information from an observation set like my uncle did, or from trail cameras, whatever that might be, whatever way you get that information. Current information is huge whenever you're trying to kill deer because they constantly change. Very, very seldom will a buck stay in one bedding area and live there for 5 months. They're changing. They're altering, whether it's hunting pressure, whether it's food sources, whether it's the rut, whether it's this or that. Deer are constantly changing what they're doing and what their patterns are. So being able to get in there when you know they're there is big.
That's huge. It is huge, and I think that's a great point too, Josh, is a lot of misconception is a deer will only have one or maybe two bedding areas based on, wind or maybe a food change, or a diet change. There's, you're making it sound like there's multitude, and I've always thought that a deer potentially could have 6, who knows, a half dozen spots that they feel really comfortable in. I know some of that is based on a deer's personality too, but from spot A in the beginning to this spot, the CRP, how far and much of a change was that?
Yeah, so this deer had been doing, I think, the same thing most of the year because I run cameras all over that farm, and so the deer that I saw, he was staying on basically the north. He was hitting all of. So I'm going to try to illustrate this, even though this is a podcast. So just imagine that this property is a big square, and you've got the CRP is pretty much throughout that property, except that there is timber that runs down the east and west sides of that square, and it's just open pastures on the north end. And now if you go out from that property, outside of that property, if you look at all the neighboring farms, there's some CRP that's off to the east. There's some pasture and crops off to the south. There's also crops off to the east too. There's nothing but crops and pasture to the north, and nothing but crops and pasture to the west. So basically, even though the neighbors have some pockets of cover and have some good bedding cover on their properties as well, primarily the bedding is on the property that we have, and then there's just food and then pasture 360. So they can go in just about any direction they want to eat. But this deer, he was living basically on the western half of the farm and really dialed in on the northwestern quadrant. And we've got 6 bucks on that property that are at least 4.5 years old or older, and it's because generally you can't do that. Generally, it's hard to, at least around here anyway. You can do that in other places, but around here, it's really difficult from just from having enough bedding cover and the hunting pressure that's out there, both on the property and surrounding properties. It's hard to pack that many 4+-year-olds into one property, especially if it's 200 acres or less. But the reason that we're able to do it there is because there's so much bedding cover, and these bucks, they don't, a lot of times, even though they will share bedding areas from time to time, especially when they're bachelored up and stuff like that, but come October, November, they will from time to time use the same bedding areas, but a lot of times they don't like to. And so these bucks can kind of space out. They've got their own little spots, and it's interesting because I've got cameras all over that farm. And those mature bucks, their core areas overlap some. Obviously, the GP, the other big wide 7 I was talking about in this 9, theirs does quite a bit. And my uncle even saw them out in the same CRP field at the same time. So, but for the most part, those big mature bucks that are on that farm, they all kind of have their own little quadrants or corners, so to speak, that they primarily stay and stick to on that farm. And so it is interesting. That deer, he was pretty much living up in the northwest corner of the farm. Now, even though he would frequent the southwest corner from time to time and the center of the property from time to time. But he pretty much did that throughout much of, the early season, or the preseason and the early season, all the way up until when I killed him. However, based on my trail cameras, I would say he bedded in at least I would say at least 7 or 8, if not more, different spots on the farm. And it was probably even more than that. But I can confidently say, just based on the way he hit trail cameras, the way we saw him from the tree, I bet he used different at least 7 or 8 different beds. And, of course, in that CRP, they can bed anywhere, especially whenever it's good, mature CRP that's at least 4 or 5 foot tall.
Yeah, that's amazing. You would think, Josh, I'd just counterpoint to what you said a little bit, and I'm only saying this because I don't know the farm, obviously, but you would think with all that CRP you would be able to have, a deer like that and the GP buck and another 1 or 2 with all that CRP and have enough bedding. But also, like you said, there is the role of dominance and, kind of overlapping, and they don't really like to do that, so that may come into play. But that CRP, man, is a game changer when it comes to bedding.
Yeah, for sure.
But that's amazing that, you identified 7 or 8 spots in that farm where he's been bedding, but really unique to, like you said, a great point is, your uncle had seen them, and that gave you that most recent information, and it just gave you that opportunity to kind of move in for attack mode. So to kind of get back to that point, we were headed that way. Your uncle saw them. They were, excuse me again, Josh, were they heading out or heading into the bed from the CRP?
Yeah, so it was a morning sit. They had, best we could tell, they had come off from one of the destination crop fields that were on neighboring properties, and of course come back to bed. It's just nuts because, like I said, we've got almost all the bedding in that area, not all of it, but almost all of it. And then there's crops all 360 around for the most part. And so morning sits are just phenomenal because you'll sit there, and the stand that I was in, we call it the sunglasses stand because it's basically right almost, not quite, but almost at the peak of the hill. And you're looking east for the most part, and then every morning the sun rises and you're pretty much blinded. But if you wear sunglasses, you see deer coming from everywhere. Well, I bet he saw that morning probably close to 40 deer. Wow. Coming back, and it's not, obviously all these deer aren't in even gun range for that matter, but you can just see so much country because you're looking. This farm lays, the high points are on the east and west sides where the timber lines are, and then it kind of creates a bowl, a big CRP bowl down below you, regardless of which side you're on, and so you can just see deer forever. I bet you could see all together. Counting the property and the neighboring fields, because you can see way off on the neighboring properties too. I bet you can see at least 300 acres. So it's pretty wild. But whenever you start scouting this farm, you start to see, okay, well, deer using this quadrant or that quadrant. And even though it's huge and it's expansive and it can be kind of intimidating, so like, well, where are these deer at? Well, if you start scouting and using cameras appropriately, and really get a line of travel on these deer where you get multiple trail camera encounters within, say, a few hour period or at least within a day, you can really figure out where these deer, where their lines of movement are, where they're going to, where they're coming from, what food destination they're trying to get to, what bedding area they're using. And so when you just pull everything together, and we talked a lot about this the last episode that we did together, it really starts to paint that picture. And so, that particular deer, whenever my uncle saw him, was coming back from a destination food source through the CRP and was bedding in the edge of the timber, and basically where the timber and the CRP met. And that's not atypical. Sometimes these deer will bed out in the CRP, but a lot of times they like to bed on those edges too because that's edge habitat, where two different types of habitats meet. And so that deer was bedding right around in there close to where those two met. And whenever I saw the deer, he was doing the same thing except in reverse because it was an afternoon hunt, and he was coming back through the CRP and eventually probably going to head toward those destination feed fields. And those fields were probably, and these are all on the neighbor, because we don't have any what I would call food, even though we do. That CRP is food for deer. It's just littered with browse. It's just food everywhere. Even though it's bedding, that's food too. Because deer are primarily browse animals, so they feed on that stuff. But, the traditional food sources that people like to think about, such as ag, food plots, stuff like that, way off on neighboring properties. I'd say the closest quote-unquote food source was probably at least 900 yards away, maybe 1,000. So it's just interesting because these deer do travel so far to get to their food sometimes.
Yeah, that is super interesting, and that is a very good point about the CRP and natural browse. I mean, I don't know how many times, I've been in CRP and almost, every time that I can remember checking anyways, Josh, you can see the ground, and actually every one I've ever been in, I want to say, that I've almost could say that, I've noticed, some type of wild clover. So, there's just always food in CRP, and it's just some of that browse that I think lots of times, a lot of us, because we identify food as ag or food plot, we just overlook that browse as good food habitat.
Mm-hmm. And that's what those big mature bucks are going to feed, because deer feed anywhere from 5 to 6 to 7 times a day, because they have, especially big deer, they have to consume a lot of food to just to maintain, let alone increase their body weight. But that's what those bucks are feeding on during the day. They might be close to their bedding areas, but they're getting up and they're feeding on browse. That's what deer live off of during the day, especially because they're getting up and they're feeding around their bedding areas. People think that deer just lay down and sleep, all day long, and they don't actually do that. Deer actually get up during the day in their bedding areas and browse around their actual beds, and that's what they're eating when they do that. They're eating browse. And so staging areas, are really, staging areas are those thick staging areas look different, from in every situation. Staging areas can look different from one to the next, but generally they're really thick, brushy, early successional habitat that's kind of situated between beds and destination food sources. And those are areas that deer a lot of the times feel comfortable in daylight, even after they've been pressured quite a bit. So, and those are full of browse-related food sources. And so deer will pass through there. Those are great hunting spots to hunt morning or afternoon. Staging areas, I actually don't like to hunt on the edges of food sources unless I know a mature deer is getting there, or if I'm trying to target, just does, or if it's the beginning of the season and I'm starting out working inward. I prefer to be back closer to those bedding areas just because it's more fun. I was right on the edge of the primary bedding that I was focused on. Again, this farm has bedding everywhere, so there's different pockets of bedding that you can kind of key on. But the particular one that I was focusing my attention, I was right on the fringe of it, right between that bedding area and where it kind of transitioned into a staging area. And deer were feeding all around me. I think I saw close to 40 deer Sunday afternoon.
Wow.
And it's just focusing on where those beds are, and then figuring out what staging areas are around those, analyzing wind directions, analyzing what food sources, establishing those lines of movement. That's huge. Knowing where they bed, knowing where they eat, figuring out where to get between point A and point B without alerting not only your target deer but other deer too, because you got to get through those waves of does and smaller bucks, as well. You can't just bank on the fact that the deer you're going after is going to be the first one out. But sometimes it works out that way, but not always. But yeah, for sure. Yeah, I think the biggest thing is focusing on those lines of movement.
Yeah, that's super important. And it just seems like, the more I learn, the more you evolve. That is really kind of what I've identified of myself, how I should be hunting, at least in Michigan, because I think it's kind of similar, to where you hunt in Kentucky, besides maybe your east spot where it might be a little more mountainous, ridges, stuff like that. We're pretty flat here, but, we just have so much thick cover. Michigan is, the undergrowth is insane. So, again, it's getting to that point, Josh, where you're like, I've identified a bedding area, and now it's like you said, you moved 10 times or something like that to make this shot happen with that deer. So it's identify it, and then don't be afraid to move again if it's not happening. And that's kind of, I got out of the stand today and did that. It was windy and wet today, so I went about 70 yards and tried to identify some more habitat and just where I can make a move. Because if you don't do that, the spot you're sitting in isn't producing. You're going to keep doing that over and over. So it's just one of those things where it's tricking yourself to say, man, I'm squeezing this bedding area, and it's kind of frightens me. I don't want to blow it out, but in the same token, it's like, well, what am I doing over here? I'm just sitting here and not seeing deer.
Right, and especially, and again, every situation is different. If you have a limited amount of time, why not hunt where the deer are? If you're the guy or girl who only can hunt they only have 5 or 6, 7 vacation days a year, and that's the week the days that you actually hunt. If you have limited time, why not go and push in where the deer at? Maybe not get all the way in the bed with them, but at least get on the fringe there where the bedding and staging areas meet. But yeah, for sure. And again, it's easier to be more aggressive like that if you have multiple places you can hunt, whether it's private or public, doesn't matter. That's irrelevant with this particular concept. But if you've only got 1, maybe 2 spots, you might want to be a little more passive, especially if you have more time to hunt and you can wait for those deer to start moving a little bit further from their beds, like they do closer to the rut. But if you've got a lot of places you can hunt, private or public, or if it's a bit, you've got a couple of spots, but they're big farms, and if you bump a deer from this bedding area, he's just going to go to another one on the same property. You can be more aggressive, and throughout the years, I've become more aggressive. But I guess the right terminology is to be patiently aggressive, because you don't want to be aggressive for the sake of being aggressive. But if you know that a deer is doing a certain thing and you know that you can get in there with a fairly good odds of getting it done, it pays to be aggressive. So you don't want to just push in for the heck of it. And I'm talking to myself here, because I have to remind myself to do this constantly, because I'll be like, oh, I know that's a good bedding area this time of year. I want to push in. Well, you can do that, but generally I won't unless I know what deer is in there. If I've got trail camera intel, or I've seen a deer do something that makes me think that's where he's at, regardless of what it is, generally, I guess the right terminology would be patiently aggressive. I don't know if that makes sense or not, but that's the way that I would refer to it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, that's so true. And based on, when I'm just was talking about myself, that was based on having identified 2 or 3 what I would call my shooter bucks on my farm where I believe they're living. They have to be living. So, I know they're there, so to speak. I just checked cameras, the whole 9 yards. One of them was just there on one of my scrapes inside the timber. So it's identifying, where, your bucks are, identify that bedding area, and then make those moves. But what you just said, Josh, was absolutely perfect. You can't go in there for the sake of going in there to say I found the bedding area. You have to have a concept and then the game plan to follow it, and make sure that you're going after the deer that you started this with. So lots of times, especially in Michigan, it's so pressured. You bump those bedding areas, you're probably not going to get another chance at it. But it's worth it, like you said, if you know and identify, hey, those guys are there. He's either in A, B, or C between these cornfield and the acorn drop. So, it's just trying to put all that together and do it on the right day. But you get a big bedding area like the one I'm hunting right now is several hundred yards long. I have a little more opportunity if I make a mistake and bump one, because he's literally only going to go 100 yards the next, which would be north of me, and bed back down, because it just is so massive and so dense in there, you almost can't hurt it unless you're completely a knucklehead, and sometimes I am, but hey.
Hey, we all are. I am too. But, I've got a spot that sounds similar to that I like to hunt from time to time, and something that I've done in the past. And, again, I in no way have no clue whatsoever whether this is applicable in your situation or not, because, like you said earlier, I don't know your farm either. But, I have a spot that sounds similar, and so sometimes what I'll do is I'll start on the edge of it and then start pushing inward a little further and a little further and a little further. And, it can be, especially if you don't know which end they're bedding on, if they're bedding on this end, that end, the middle, or wherever it is, starting on the fringe and going inward, a little bit further each time, that's paid off for me some in the past too, as I'm sure it has for you. But, it's fun. It's a chess match. It really is. A lot of people refer to it that way. Deer hunting can be checkers if you want it to be checkers, but deer hunting can also be chess if you want it to be chess. And, that's the fun aspect of it for me. The number one reason is because I love eating deer meat, but that the challenge is the next best part.
Yeah, it is. It's ultimately the best. But, again, I don't want to, sorry, I'm jumping all over you a little bit, Josh, but just wanted to compare apples to apples, because it's so important to have context to what we're saying. And there's so many people at so many different levels of hunting that, I want to get across the right message to everybody. But getting back to your deer, Josh, ended up making this last move. Let's go through this, part of the hunt real quick. You ended up doing another hang and bang, and was it an evening or a morning sit?
Well, like I said earlier, this particular deer was first time in for me because the deer that I hunted the first part of the year, I didn't get it done on that deer, and so I ended up, before he shifted to a neighboring property where his fall range is. So the deer that I actually killed is kind of two separate storylines, but it's just kind of the progression of my season. The deer that I ended up killing was actually the first time in for me on that farm. So even though I was talking about two different deer there, so I apologize if I accidentally strung them together. But that was just the progression of how my season played out. But no, this was actually the first time in for the deer that I ended up killing. My uncle saw that deer the previous day, the previous morning, which was also his first time in on that property, which again, there might be a little takeaway there. Since we do have the three farms that we hunt, we leave this north farm, which is the one that I ended up killing my deer on, we leave it alone until mid to late October and don't touch it for the first month and a half of deer season. At least sometimes we leave it till late October or early November, depending on the year. But and we hunt the other two farms early season and throughout the season. But so there's a takeaway there, because a lot of times if a deer does get repeatedly pressured, it takes some repeated pressure to push deer off of a farm completely, but it can happen. Again, it goes back to the deer's personality, but the reason that we do that is because a lot of times, at least in my experience, if you have a deer that is established in his fall range and he's in his fall range, and you leave that deer alone until late October, especially early November, right on the onset, beginning of that rut period, whenever does start beginning to trickle into estrus, even if you bump that deer, in my experience, he won't leave, at least not until the rut's over. And so that's the reason that we leave this north farm alone generally until that time frame, is simply for that fact. But, I'm not sure what your question was. I kind of went on a tangent there, but as far as transitioning to that period, sorry, go ahead.
Yep, just about the question was just about this hang and hunt and you going in and actually killing them. So I was just asking if it was morning or evening hunt. I know your uncle had seen him and you made that move.
Yeah, my uncle saw him the first morning of muzzleloader, which is a Saturday. He saw the deer that morning, and then I eased in there and got in position the next afternoon, so Sunday afternoon.
Okay. So Sunday afternoon, you walked in there, and I assume, Josh, you kind of previously already had identified maybe a bedding area that you thought you were going to go in and kind of
right.
Yep. Try to get it stand up.
Absolutely, and for sure, because we've been hunting this property for 5 years, and so having that historical information was a big part of it, because knowing what deer historically do is very important. Especially, and not just from deer to deer, but just as a whole, in general, knowing what the herd does and how they use the farm is huge. Then, whenever you have multiple years of history with a particular deer, like I did with this one, even though that aspect of the equation wasn't quite as beneficial for me as it can be for some deer, I had that as well, because this is the second year that the third year I've had a history with that deer. I think it could have been 3 years, but it's for sure 2 years. But anyway, but also had cameras running all over that farm, and I think I'd pulled cards twice this year. Once before the season opened and back in the summer, and then once I think it was in September, maybe early October. So having those two card pulls and those thousands of pictures to sift through and paint that picture of how this particular deer and other target bucks were using the farm, it kind of helped me move in. And then I paired that information, the historical information, the trail camera information, and the real-time information from the day before where my uncle saw it. And I didn't move in on my uncle's deer or anything like that. He couldn't hunt there the rest of the weekend, and so I ended up going and hunting for him. And we do that. Like, I help him, he helps me. thing with the rest of my family members because I hunt with several of them. But we all help each other out, and if we know that we've got a good beat on a deer and one of us can't keep hunting that deer, if we get a beat on him, we sub somebody in, and we just kind of help each other out like that. But anyway, yeah, having all that information was really what it took to be able to push in and make that final move to get the deer on the ground Sunday afternoon.
Yeah, that's awesome, man. It's such a great deer, and I think it's such a great story that we had previously already talked about, some of the things you were doing throughout the summer and how this kind of all, unfolded, and it just so unique to what we had previously talked about. But so many good takeaways in this talk, Josh, just from really identifying all those food sources and then trying to identify those bedding near those food sources and not to overlook those natural browse. So a lot of great stuff you said today, Josh, and man, what an awesome buck. And I know that it'll be this week or next week it'll be on Midwest Whitetail. Is that right, Josh? Or
yeah, it should be either this coming week or maybe the week after. But I guess one more final takeaway too is the fact that we had rain push through on Sunday, and it rained from mid-morning on Sunday until probably mid to late afternoon on Sunday. And so I was able to push in and get into where I was going in the rain and get set up, get in there. And, obviously the ground was wet, the leaves were wet. The sound from the rain was covering up. The wind was covering up my sound as well. And so that was huge, too, because I've killed so many. A lot of people don't like to hunt on rainy days, but I love a rainy day. I love walking to my tree stand in the rain because of the fact that it covers up it helps cover up your scent some, but it primarily really covers up your sound. And I would say, if I had to guess, that the stand that I was in, because I didn't see this deer get up out of his bed like that other deer that I was hunting a couple of times earlier in the season on a different farm, but I didn't see this deer stand up out of his bed. But if I had to guess, I would say that I was in a tree that was anywhere from 60 to maybe 100 yards from him, from where he was bedding. So being inside of that bedding bubble, so to speak, is really crucial. It's really critical, being close enough to those deer to catch them moving in daylight. And it doesn't matter if it's September early season or what people like to refer to as the October lull, that time frame. Regardless of when it is, being able to get inside of that bedding bubble and being where deer are comfortable moving in daylight is big. And then having that rain to cover your scent and to cover your sound, and the wind to, blowing sticks and leaves and stuff to kind of help cover you visually too. That's all huge. And so hunting on rainy days is really big for me, especially if that rain is going to stop around mid to late afternoon. I'm not a biologist, I'm not a researcher, but it just really seems to me like it spurs deer to move. I've not seen a lot of deer move well while it's raining, but I've seen deer just absolutely pour out of the woodworks right after it stops. And so if it stops right at the end of legal shooting light, that's not helped me much historically. But if it stops anywhere from 45 minutes to 2 hours before legal light ends in the afternoon, that's led to quite a few of my bigger bucks.
Yeah, that's a huge tip, and I couldn't agree with you more, Josh. That at least deer movement wise, I've seen so many deer. When the sky sort of breaks and you almost can feel it, Josh. I know you know what I'm talking about, but it's almost like here it comes. But mark that down, guys, as a tip that you want to follow. I don't care if you're using like a HuntWise app, a Hunt Stand, a DeerCast, but if it's raining, especially like Josh just detailed it out, ends sometime in the afternoon, just be in that stand before that rain ends and look out, because, man, it is one of the most identifiable weather tricks to a hunt that you can absolutely have. So that was cool, Josh. I didn't know about the rain, but that's a neat little setup you had. What would you say, Josh, is your ideal bubble when you're pushing in on that bedroom? Is it 50 to 100 yards? I think is sort of reasonable, or do you like to push it as close as you can get?
Yeah, so it depends on every situation is different. But basically, as close as you can get without bumping that deer, in my mind. I don't think you ever want to try to get inside of 50. that's just too risky. It doesn't matter what the situation looked like. He's going to have to be bedded, inside of a brick wall, 4 walls around him to be able to do anything inside of 50 usually. But, I've gotten within 50. I've gotten within 60. I've gotten within 75 quite a few times on different deer throughout the past couple of decades, especially the last decade or so. But I really think that if I had to give an average number, if the terrain is flat, if it's relatively flat terrain, now if you've got varying topography and a deer is bedded up on a ridge, that changes things, especially if you have to come in from the low side. If you've got to come in on the low side of a deer that's bedded up on a hillside, that's going to be tough. Now, if you can come across the back side of the ridge and kind of swing in above that deer, and you have the access to do that, that kind of helps negate that just a little bit or offset that advantage that deer has. But again, you have to have the right access and be able to come from the right side of the property to do that. So every situation is different, but if it just in a general flat terrain scenario, and the deer is bedding in relatively thick cover to where he's not going to be able to see more than 75 yards, I'd say anywhere inside of 100 is good. If you can get to 75, great. If you can get to 60, that's pretty awesome. But, the closer you get to that deer, the more risk there is, as far as bumping it. But being able to slip in close to those deer, especially inside of 100 yards, even 100 yards, you've got to have some wind cover. You've got to be, super quiet. I mean, those two, the other deer that I was hunting before I killed the deer that I ended up killing, I didn't kill that deer, obviously, like I said earlier, but, I had those 2 close encounters where I slipped into about 50 and 60 yards of his bed. But I had high winds that day that allowed me to get there. He was bedding in some pretty thick stuff. I bet that deer couldn't see 10 yards in any direction. So there's certain factors there. Obviously when I did the hanging hunt, I came up the back side of the tree because whenever I did get up in the stand, I could see his rack, just the very top tip of his rack. And, of course, if that deer stands up, boom, he can see it. So, there's a lot of factors there. But I would say generally anywhere from 75 to 125 is a good number when you're trying to get close to a bed and catch a deer moving in daylight if you know what his line of movement is and you're kind of between his bed and his destination, whether that's water or food or whatever it might be. 75 to 125 yards is a pretty good figure if you have the concealment to do so. Anything inside of 100 is pretty solid, though, and anything inside of 75 is money if you can make it happen.
That's a good tip, and that's like Josh is saying, that is as safe as you want to do it. You press too much, man. They're just too smart, and they hear too well and see too well. They're just going to get you, but there's so many factors that come into all that stuff that, take that into consideration as well. But like Josh said, the one buck literally couldn't see 10 yards either direction. But sometimes it's not like that, and they'll bust you at 50. So, it just hopefully things align the right way. But that, I couldn't agree with you more, Josh. That 50 to 100 just seems like a safe bet.
Yeah, and my final tip of the day is, even if you're a gun hunter, hunt like you're a bow hunter. I mean, this was muzzleloader weekend. I did kill that deer with a muzzleloader, but I shot him at 10 steps. Just wow. Because I'm packing a gun doesn't. I used to whenever I was early on. Of course, everybody changes throughout their life as a hunter, but and start do things differently from time to time. But early on, whenever I during rifle season when I was a kid and teenager. I would just cover as much ground as I could cover. If he's 200 yards, 300 yards, as long as I'm packing a gun that can do it, that's where I want to sit. And granted, the spot that I was in, I could see a lot of country. I said that earlier. It's a big, massive CRP farm, and it's a big, huge, massive bowl of CRP, and so I could see a long ways. But that's not the reason I was there. The reason I was there is because I knew that buck was bedded right on the edge of that timber in CRP, just inside the timber. And, I knew that's where I needed to be to catch him moving in daylight. So I guess my final tip would be is if you're muzzleloader hunting, if you're gun hunting, don't just go sit somewhere where you can see a bunch of wide open for the sake of seeing a bunch of wide open. Still hunt like you're a bow hunter, because especially if you're trying to target those mature deer. Because it doesn't matter if it's the rut. If you've got an ultra-mature deer, yeah, you might see a doe drag a big buck across a cornfield. It happens every year. People kill them doing that all the time, so there's nothing wrong with that. But especially if you're hunting a gun season outside of the rut, you're very likely not going to see a big deer out in the middle of a field or a wide open expanse area, unless it's like a CRP field where they feel comfortable moving in daylight. So, there's nothing wrong with hunting big wide open fields during rifle season if your rifle season is during the rut. But if you're hunting like an early muzzleloader or a late muzzleloader, if your gun season falls outside of that rut, hunt like you're a bow hunter.
That's a great tip too, man. Josh, what do you got left? Your Kentucky tag is punched. Do you have other trips lined up?
Yeah, so my deer season is still just getting started. I hunt with a guy named John Kirby. He's kind of my primary partner for Midwest Whitetail, and we've both punched our Kentucky tags. But I have quite a few family members that I hunt with and film, so I'll be hunting with several family members here at home. I've still got doe tags to fill here at home, which I fill those too. But as far as bucks go, my next stop, and my friend John, our next stop, both is going to be in Ohio. We've got a small property that we hunt up there. It also connects, it doesn't connect, but it's close to some other public ground that's in that area. And so we hunt both the private and the public, usually. And so that'll be our next stop buck-wise. And then if we get done there, then we'll transition over and I'll start hunting some public land in Indiana. That's kind of my play each year. I start in Kentucky, and when I get done in Kentucky, I go to Ohio. And if I get done in Ohio, then I'll transition over to hunt some public up in Indiana. And then every now and then I'll throw in another oddball state somewhere in the Midwest for a quick trip, but I don't think I'm going to be doing that this year.
Sounds good, man. Well, good luck in Ohio, and hopefully we can do this again. I would love to talk to you about some Ohio hunting. I'll be down there next month as well, so that'll be interesting. I'd like to compare notes on what I learned, because Ohio is a new state to me, and I'm in hunting southern Ohio, which is totally different, just big ridges and deep bottoms, and unlike anything I've ever hunted before. So it would be neat to compare notes, to say the least.
For sure, I've been I'm in southeastern Ohio is where I hunt, and it sounds like it's the same exact terrain, same exact situation. But I've been hunting up there for, I think this is the fourth year. Maybe this is the fourth or fifth year that I've been hunting southeastern Ohio, and it is some beautiful country, and I hope you have some good luck up there.
Yeah, thanks, man. Same to you, and thanks again, Josh, and make sure everybody checks out the episode with Josh and Midwest Whitetail, and Josh, we'll do it again. Thanks so much.